My name is Dermot O'Callaghan and I am CEO of Sing Ireland, but it's my pleasure to be here to introduce and chair this discussion. We have some fascinating examples of artists and neuroscientists working together and indeed separately that we will explore today. And I want it to be all about them, so I'll say very little at the beginning, but I do want to say this session, as we say, is around neuroscience and how it meets creativity in action. And we have brilliant, fantastic examples across art forms and from different disciplines in neuroscience as well being exemplified today. As I was thinking about today's session, there were two reflections I had, and I think they'll be exemplified, I'm sure, through what we will hear from the fantastic speakers today. One was around the state of flow and the mindful practice that is creative expression for people of every age and from every background, and how that research around that helps us to process. That's the second part, helps us to process and reflect and maybe distract in some cases from things that might be traumatic, such as pandemic or lockdowns or our circumstances. And I suppose in the wider picture, I was thinking about what's going on in an extreme situation in Ukraine, and what is the role of the arts and creativity there in terms of helping to find meaning and find a life well lived, even in extreme circumstances. And I know that will be connected to some further talks that are happening tomorrow. I'll flag them again later. So I want to really quickly get to our first two speakers. We have about 20 minutes per each group of fantastic two people we have. So I'll introduce the first two. This is Anna Newell and Cliona O'Doherty. And Anna is a theatre maker for young audiences, and Cliona is a PhD student in the Cusack Lab, working at the intersection of adult neuroimaging, artificial intelligence, and infant developmental neuroscience. So really a fantastic and interesting pairing. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to go and hand over to Anna and Cliona. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Can we get the first slide? Brilliant, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. First of all, I'm going to apologise. I'm going to head off as soon as we've done this. You've probably seen a few of us hanging around in slightly garish 70s costumes. We're creating a show for babies at the moment, so I'm off to do some more stuff on that after this. Cliona and I were put together for this panel, and we had a really interesting discussion on Zoom and found that there was a load of things that we had in common. So the way we decided to play this is that we would each just chat really briefly about what it is and what we do, and then chat a bit about some of the discussion that we had when we started finding commonalities in terms of what we did. So I've been working as a professional theatre director since 1989. And for the last 12 years, I've been making shows for babies, shows for early years audiences, and shows for children and young people with complex needs. I'm privileged that my work's been seen on 6 continents. I was the first artist on this island to create work specifically for children and young people with complex needs. And I was delighted to be invited by the wonderful Magnet Theatre to come to Cape Town and to play a really small part in creating the first ever theatre for babies in South Africa. And my youngest audience member was 4 days old. And since last year, I've been on a new adventure, bringing together 8 venues from across this island to form what I've called the Network for Extraordinary Audiences, with these venues committing strategically and in the long term to programming, developing, and advocating for high-quality arts experiences for these underserved younger audiences. About 12 years ago, when I was making the first show that I made for kids with complex needs, I was doing some creative consultation in a classroom of children with profound and multiple learning difficulties. And in the course of those few days, those young people reveal to me what it is that I think theatre is. And theatre is many different things for many different people. But for me, it's one human being connecting with another human being, and that's it. Oscar Wilde says it how it is. He says, "I regard theatre as the greatest of all art forms, the most immediate way in which a human being can share with another human being the sense of what it is to be a human being." And so I consider my job to be to create the optimum conditions for that connection. And I do that inspired and informed by bits and pieces of early years neuroscience that I've magpied over the years, particularly from people like Suzanne Zedek, trauma-informed or rather relationship-led practice. And with shows like Baby Groove that we have upstairs, I often use portable performance spaces, which creates spaces where those whose cognitive processing is slower than neurotypical can genuinely engage and can genuinely have agency, are seen as individuals, and are at the very center of leading the experience. We use a huge amount of voice, but we don't use any words. And we use objects as a way to have conversation, as a conduit for connection between the performer and the audience member, rather than just a thing to waggle in front of a child or a baby. And we have babies in on development as our creative consultants from as early as day 2. So one of the questions I'm often asked is, what does this kind of theatre look like? So I'm going to show you a few pictures. And in these images, you'll see some of the things that we do, some of the props that we use. But hopefully, most of all, you'll see the connection. Another theatre maker on the other side of the world puts it like this: doing theatre for babies is to explore the unknown. It goes against common sense. It's political. It's also necessary, I believe, because babies have a right to beauty and they're not always exposed to it. Theatre for babies implies commitment, but a commitment that draws us in. It's the opposite of cynicism. It's hope in its purest form. It's an attempt to talk with the beginning of the world.
I think I'll take over from there.
I have just stolen your notes.
Yeah, you're grand. So we still have the slideshow up. So thank you so much for handing me that quote, Anna, because really, to me, it was such an insight into not only what it is to make theatre for babies, but it really lets me explain how we talk with the beginning of the world, but we do it through science instead. So I'm a neuroscientist, and I'm ultimately interested in how the brain works. More specifically, I want to know how we learn to understand the world around us. How do we know what the things that we see mean, and how do we develop such a rich and astonishing knowledge of everything around us? And it really happens so much in the first few years of life. So I naturally want to ask these questions in some of the best learners that we know of, which is really human infants. So what you highlighted here is that to make theatre for babies is an exploration of the unknown, but what struck me is that is inherent to doing science. All it is exploring things that we're not sure of, that we don't know. But to do this, specifically in infants, we really have to be creative and innovate in order to ask these questions and develop rigorous methods that we can begin to understand what it means to have this beginning of the world. So when I tell people what I do every week, specifically the part about putting 2 and 9-month-old babies in MRI scanners, getting them to lie awake, and we record their brain activity, people are always like, you're crazy, there's no way that would work, how do you do that? And it's hard, it's very challenging. But I have found that quite a lot of the challenges that come with it are coming from our need to push back on what might traditionally be things, the way we do things in adult science, or traditional beliefs that we have about the world from our own experience. So we really have to find new ways of working if we want to understand what's going on inside infants' minds. At the end of the day, we don't know anything about how you experience the world in your first few years of life. Our own brains make sure that we have complete amnesia from this period. There was so much going on and it was so difficult that we don't remember any of it. So we can't ascribe our own ideas of the world onto this time period. So we have to trust in the innovative methods that we come up with to really understand the infant's brain. I like this figure from Smith and Sloan, who came up with this way of looking into infants' visual experience in their first few years of life by putting head cams on the infants and letting them go about their daily lives in their houses and then analyzing what it is that they saw. So we can see that not only is the visual experience vastly different from how we see the world, but it changes a lot from 1 month up to 2 years. Starts by focusing on your faces and ceilings, because you're lying on your back a lot, up to objects within your grasp as you learn to develop that skill. So without having come up with this new way of testing and doing experiments, Smith and Sloan may never have revealed such interesting results as this to us. So what are some other ways that scientists are studying infants? Well, like myself and the Cusack Lab team do here every week in Trinity, we spent months and months planning how to get infants to lie awake in these MRI scanners. So we show them videos that are specifically chosen that the babies are safe, comfortable, and enjoying themselves, and also that we can test specifically questions that we want to know about their cognition and uncover how they're developing over the first year of life. So this really isn't the traditional way we do adult MRI scanning. We've changed a lot of things, but we had to spend the time being creative and coming up with those ideas. Some other ways is using infants' gaze and their looking patterns to uncover what it is they might be thinking. And by using this trick, there's a wealth of studies that have revealed really interesting things about infants' brains that we wouldn't have been able to get from these little people who can't tell us what they're thinking. So we can do this in the lab or once again at home. And by bringing science into the home in this non-traditional way, we open up a whole new world of experimentation that we can do. So I hope that from Anna's talk about the importance of connection in her work, and then my own discussion of how you need to be creative in studying infant science, I think I really discovered as I was preparing this that there's a common thread between these two seemingly quite disparate fields, which is creativity. And I think working with infants demands creativity. And at the end of the day, who's more creative and imaginative than babies and young infants? But really what I found is that I'm learning so much from working with infants, and it's the type of knowledge that I can't show you in results in a publication or in a talk, because working with them, that's truly a fundamental lesson in creativity. So I think from Anna and I, when we were talking before, we just have we want to talk a bit more about the commonalities between our two work like this. So the first one, I think, maybe I'll move down to our seat so that we can talk a bit more. The first one which you touched on, which I think that we really find as well, is the idea of creating the optimum conditions for infants to thrive in these ways. So for us, it would be things like, typically in MRI studies, you look at the stimuli that we're showing you on a mirror above you, and you're in this big coil, and it's kind of a bit awkward. But for the infants, instead, we use this method where we project it down and on top of the scanner. So now they're just like in the IMAX, and they're like loving their lives, lying down there watching the videos. So without doing that, I don't think we would be getting the data that we're getting right now. So maybe do you have an example of creating the optimum conditions?
Yes, we think a huge amount about how we welcome our audiences in and how we make the situation from the moment they arrive. In fact, before, when we're talking about how we make that situation really welcoming for the adults who come with them. And we partner a lot with non-theatre organisations who would be working with families who might traditionally not access a theatre space, and use those guys as ambassadors to make families feel welcome who otherwise might not. But when we're talking a lot we have 2 new performers in the show this time, and one of the things that I was saying to them, which I always say to performers, is you never would go up to another adult and shout hello in their face and touch them. But people do it all the time to babies. Or if I meet a baby for the first time and do that, and so it hides behind its parents' legs, people will say it's shy. And I'll say, no, they just want a bit of time to look at me and to kind of get to know me. And I talk a lot to the performers about how it's a bit like a party. Like, I kind of want to look at you for a bit to see, do I want to talk to you? Well, I think I maybe do want to talk to you, so maybe I'll let you come a bit closer. I'll start talking about something, but yeah, you're not really interested in that. Maybe I'll try talking about something else. So the way that the shows are structured, Baby Groove, for example, the sung score, which is written by a composer I've worked with 30 years, who's actually up the back, who also wrote the beautiful piece of music you heard there, Scottish composer David Goodall, that remains the same, and the immersive video remains the same, but everything else changes. When I first decided I wanted to make it, I said, this is going to be a happening, a 70s-inspired happening for babies. In fact, we made the first version of it last year for children and young people with complex needs. And when I looked up a loose definition of what a happening was, it was, well, there's music and there's visuals, and everything else is about who's there and what they bring. And that's exactly how the shows work. And we have a very small capacity, and we respond to them as individuals and as a tiny temporary community. And so everything that we do is about making the parents and caregivers and children feel welcome, feel safe, and feel able to engage in a way that they want to engage, to genuinely have agency. And all of the audiences I work with are groups who very often don't have agency.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I also do adult experiments, and it's in and out the MRI scanner as well, and I would never spend time thinking, okay, so what's going to happen when they come in? Will they be comfortable? How do we get them to go into the scanner? It's just, there's like this whole other thing you have to consider, but it's absolutely as important, because we really wouldn't be getting what we're getting. Like, I also was skeptical before we collected any data. I was like, how are we going to get this to happen? But like, I think it's taking the time on that and putting the infant first, and just letting go of what you think it might be, and instead listening to them.
But I think what you said when you were talking, which I think is really key to that, which is about how much they can teach us.
Yes.
My father, who was a researcher, worked a lot in creating communication for people who didn't have traditional verbal communication. He has a whole list of things that were initially invented in order to facilitate people who didn't have traditional verbal communication to communicate, like the ballpoint pen or the cassette tape or predictive text. And they're things that benefit us all. And if we, as scientists or medics or theatre makers, thought about how we welcomed our audience. I do that now when I make adult theatre. If we gave the same level of care to and detail to how we connect with adults as we do to babies, I think everybody would benefit. So the babies just teach us all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Keep going, by all means.
Yeah, perfect. I think that just probably touches on the last thing we wanted to discuss, which I mentioned a bit as well, which is, I think we have to let go sometimes of the traditional ways that we do things in adult. I mean, I know from my own experience in theatre, like we have very set training, and then as a scientist as well, I have very set training. And like when it comes to working with audiences like this or populations like this, you just have to let go of that a little bit and embrace that new thing or the unknown thing. And then, like you said, it really brings out this whole other world that we didn't know about. And it's really interesting to hear that your adult theatre work as well benefits from that same approach.
And I think there is something ultimately transformative about connecting with babies. And I did a project, again with David, a few years ago where we, which is a real leap of faith. It was inspired by Roots of Empathy. It was inspired by my own experience of working with babies. And we invited 12 transition year students to come and work intensively with us for 2 weeks. And we made a show for babies that they performed in. And it was about, well, what happens if we take people who are at a similar but very different moment of neuroplasticity in their life, and connect them up. And it was a ridiculous roller coaster. All of the teenagers said in the evaluation at the end that they'd thought about leaving the project because it didn't make sense to them. And then the babies came in, and it made sense. And in their final evaluation, we were lucky to pair up with Imolab here, which specialises in the teenage brain. And a number of them said they felt like different people because that's what the babies do.
That's it.
I'm so sorry. This is endlessly fascinating, and I could personally listen to it for a very long time. But I unfortunately do need to move on. But
Yes.
and I'm sure there's time for questions. We might get some time for that at the end. But I suppose a reflection, a couple of things really struck me very briefly. Babies as creative consultants was really a powerful reflection, I think. And I think the hope and the inherent creativity of babies and where that is for each of your work is really clear. So maybe we can get some time at the end. I'm so sorry. We better move on. Thank you so much, Cliona and Anna. Thanks again. So as Anna and Cliona are moving aside, we are going to move to Amelia McConville and Francesca Farina, who are going to discuss poetry, climate change, and interdisciplinarity. Amelia is a PhD student researching experimental poetry and visual poetics from both a literary and neurohumanities perspective. And Francesca Farina is a cognitive neuroscientist whose research focuses on identifying and addressing risk factors for dementia. So I'll pass over to them. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dermot. Cheers. So hello everyone. When Francesca and I were put together in the initial programming for this event, we were delighted because we'd already met each other, never in person, but we'd had plenty of contact over Zoom, and we'd worked together before. Francesca was one of the Atlantic Fellows. I'm introducing you here, but she was one of the Atlantic Fellows who spoke as part of an initiative that myself and my colleague Autumn Brown ran, which was the Art and Science Salon. And we got Francesca and a couple of the other Atlantic Fellows in to speak about what they were doing with GBHI, and that's how we originally met and how I heard about the Pomethon project. So maybe you might introduce yourself as well, say a little bit about the Pomethon or...
Absolutely, yeah. It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And it's a pleasure for so many different reasons. And one of those is finally getting to meet Amelia in person on stage. This is great. So, yeah, Pomethon is one of the initiatives that we had talked about when we thought about what we might might want to share with the group today. And it's an initiative, it's a collaboration between the Global Brain Health Institute at Trinity College in Dublin and Poetry Ireland. So as mentioned, I'm a neuroscientist, psychologist by background, but really any excuse I can get to talk to people outside of my discipline, I've always seemed to seek out those opportunities, and Pomethon was one of those. So I suppose, what is a Pomethon? It's basically a collaborative poem, a big collaborative poem. And what we do is we invite somebody to write an opening line for a poem, and then and that could be around a theme. So we've run this initiative twice, and Poetry Ireland have run it 3 times in total. So last year's theme was the COVID-19 lockdown, and we focused specifically on older generations. So as many people know, in Ireland, older generations in particular were asked to stay home and cocoon. And this was quite a divisive term. A lot of people really didn't like it. So we decided to plan our poem around that theme. And we invited John Sheehan from the Dubliners to compose the first line of that. And I have a little snippet that, if we have time, I'd love to read you some of the submissions that we got. And then this year's theme is on the climate crisis. And we're so lucky to have our opening line being written by former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson. So we take the first line, and then we open it up and we say, okay, people, think about this line and write something in response, or a reflection on the theme in general. And then we have our amazing editor, Seamus Cashman, processing all of these as they come in and seeing where they fit together. And essentially he brings it all together into a single piece. Or last year's poem, we had over 500 lines. So it was more like a series of poems that all fit together, separated into 8 parts. So it's a big kind of write one, pass it along kind of theme.
Absolutely, and when Francesca originally told me about this, that made me very excited as someone who's coming from the English department, and as a literary scholar, I was fascinated by this because, as we were saying, it evokes an experimental poetic form in and of itself, which is called the cento, whereby a poem is constructed that's comprised of lines that are taken from other poems by different poets. So when I heard about this originally from Francesca, I was like, oh, it's a cento. And she was like, I don't know if that's how we've influenced it, you know? So it was this kind of fascinating thing that this collaborative poetic project that, as you said, focused on such incredibly important themes throughout the pandemic, and for people that were older, and like you said, forced to cocoon, this sort of strange phrase that suddenly entered the sort of general parlance. I was like, this sounds exactly like a cento, and it was so fascinating that almost organically in this project that was, I suppose, designed to serve people's sort of collective processing of the pandemic, ended up evoking this quite ancient poetic form that I had studied myself. So, and
I had never heard of. You know, yeah. I remember the you know, being in school and your friend writes something, a line, and then you turn over the paper, and then you write a line and you turn it over. So I had heard of that, but not the cento. So it's so interesting. And I think for us last year with Pomethon, just thinking to the previous conversation and speakers, you know, talking about babies and children, I think we would never ask babies and children, we would never come up with a policy that would say all children now have to stay in and have to cocoon. And I just think that's very interesting that became part of the strategy for dealing with this, and yeah, Pomethon was a way to kind of take the pulse of that. But I'm so interested in your work, because you're working really at the intersection of poetry and neuroscience, and even when you say things like experimental poetry, you know, what is that? Could you talk a little bit?
It's a great question, absolutely. I think it's also fascinating, before I answer the question, to note that, like, you know, both of us are arguably working in sort of neurohumanities and poetry together, and yet our experiences and perspectives are completely different. You know, like I said, this overlap of the Pomethon and the work that Francesca was doing versus the work that I'm doing, it couldn't be more different, even though we are both combining, in a sense, poetry and neuroscience. So yeah, I work at Neurohumanities, so my background is like I said, very much as a literary studies scholar. But I've always been very interested in this intersection between art and science, and I was lucky enough within Trinity to have joint supervision with both the School of English and TCIN here. So that ended up bringing me to the point I'm at now in the final year of my doctoral research, where I'm looking at visual poetry, experimental poetry, and poetics, and asking what an understanding of cognitive science, psychology, and or neuroscience can bring to our understanding of experimental poetic works. So, I mean, in a word, like it's I suppose it's when I'm talking about visual and experimental poetry, I'm talking about poetry that doesn't necessarily constrain itself to language. It's not always possible to read this kind of poetry aloud. I sadly don't have any examples, but there's plenty of kind of ones. If you Google concrete or visual poetry, you'll find loads of different examples. But I'm interested then on when it comes to like the literary study of this kind of poetry and its analysis, there's quite what I would describe as quite a cognitive obstacle, or a kind of a critical obstacle when it comes to the analysis and critiquing of this kind of poetry. It's almost as if literary theory, the moment you start bringing a text from language and words into the visual, as a lot of the work that I study does, that you encounter this obstacle. And then I thought, well, an interesting way to kind of maybe bridge this would be to explore what an understanding of neuroscience, a cognitive science, visual psychology can bring to that debate. So that's how I ended up where I am now. But again, like I said, it's interesting that both of us, we combine these two topics and our experiences could not be more different. It's fascinating.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting, it's coming from a neuroscience background, when you talk about sort of different forms, and makes me think of perception and all of our different senses. And one of the things I've thought about a lot with Pomethon is how it works. So because it was during the pandemic, we had to receive our submissions via an online form. And it just seems such I don't know, not a traditional form that would get the poetic juices flowing in people. And so I'm so curious, from your perspective, what do you think that kind of format does, or does it change? Does it influence the work, or how the work is produced or received?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question, and particularly I would think a lot about, I suppose, what you're saying there about receiving the lines from the poetry and having to assemble them from the perspective of somebody who is receiving them online, as opposed to this romantic notion of them being covered in sort of written on scraps of paper, or sort of sorry, I think my mic is a little. But you think of this romantic notion of them being covered on scraps of paper, or written. Sorry, is my mic okay? I think there's a bit of interference here. Yeah.
Me.
Not sure if that's me or not, but I'll keep talking anyway. Hopefully we'll be okay. But yeah, so I think that in terms of digital. Oh, it's more. Yeah, perfect. Okay, thanks so much. Sorry. So yeah, when it comes to how you collected this, I think the form of how you receive the poetry is absolutely an essential part of its construction. Like I was saying, when it comes to the cento, in traditional forms, you kind of think of it as, I suppose, being associated with scraps of paper, or even the Dada process, the cut-up method that often gets talked about in literary kind of circles, where you've got a bag full of words that are written on pieces of paper, and you throw them out on the ground in whatever order they come out with, that's the poem. So you've got all these kind of experimental means that from a literary studies perspective are incredibly important in defining the finished product. But I suppose then in this context, it's fascinating because, like you said, you're taking the lived experience of people from a very kind of traumatic event. And I think to kind of sum up is that I suppose the medium in which poetry is now presented is so important. Mm-hmm. I think often of poems that are written now designed to be I suppose distributed via social media. You have poets that often come to great prominence online that write poems to fit into the square of an Instagram tile. And that in and of itself, I think, is fascinating, because obviously when it comes to the material world and publishing poetry in books and, in pamphlets and journals, there's obviously the constraints that you have to work within, which are the limits of the page and the page-bound poem, that at the end of the day, it has to be black words on a white page. When we move into the digital realm, as we are now, like you just said, you're receiving these pieces online. That whole relationship to materiality changes completely, and therefore the relation to experimental poetics also changes. So yeah, a bit of a rambly answer to your question there.
No, it's perfect.
Yeah. I was fascinated to ask you a little bit about the editing process for this poem. Maybe you could say a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I think Seamus would be the one to ask, but to me, I've heard him describe it because he processes as lines come in. So we might leave submissions open for a month, and he gets a lot. So he starts to form sort of groups, I guess, based on feeling. So he's a poet himself, has been for many years. So it's quite hard to distill, that kind of experience and explain it to somebody who's in a completely different field. And I'd love to ask you about that, but we'll get there. But so he processes them, he groups them, and then that structure could completely change by the end, by when the submissions close. So I'm fascinated by the idea of several living poems within this process, and I would love to track that. I think the process itself of editing is nearly as interesting or more interesting than what comes out at the end. You could have 10 different poems and then you have a final poem, and I think that's really fascinating in itself as a process within poetry.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing as well that like I'm always conscious of in my own research is that I have to approach the work that I'm looking at from a variety of different perspectives, and particularly with the experimental component of the research that I'm approaching now, you know, like I'm going to be hopefully testing a pretty wide range of people and conducting a small scale like, empirical experiment that takes visual poetry as the stimulus. And I'm so conscious of the fact that I'm going to be showing that to a variety of lay people, poetry scholars, poetry students, normal people, people who hate poetry. So that kind of dynamic in and of itself of the different modes in which you can view a poem, like the different hats that you put on to perceive one, is something that fascinates me, because I know myself, I also have to look at it from a neurohumanities scholar perspective, from a literary perspective, from a personal perspective. So I suppose with that in mind, I'd love to ask you, how do you approach a poem as a person and as a neuroscientist?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Can you separate the neuroscientist from the woman? Who knows? If I think of it personally, poetry to me seems a little bit like magic. It's very mysterious. And when I talk to people who work in that space, I sort of find myself sitting there thinking, wow, wow, wow. And that's what happens. Whereas if I think of poetry from a neuroscience perspective, or as a neuroscientist, or how I work with poetry in my own sort of space, I think poetry, for me, certainly with these projects, is in some ways a bit of a tool. It's a way of communicating to a broader audience. So I know, you know, scientific papers were mentioned a minute ago, and that's how we work a lot of the time, but oftentimes you want that message to go beyond just the scientific community. And for me, being able to tackle topics like the climate crisis through the medium of poetry is so useful, and allows us to reach such a bigger audience. We know in research there's a lot more about what the climate crisis is doing to our brain health, both in terms of noise pollution, air pollution. So in terms of the research side, we know a lot about what's going on, but it's how do we get that out there, or how do we create a space to engage people in a dialogue that goes beyond that academic sphere. So things like Pomethon for me are kind of this amazing opportunity to do that and to reach out to people and kind of read that pulse and see what comes back.
Absolutely. I love how you've described that, because I think on the flip side, from the literary perspective, you know, there can often be a lot of debates in these kind of spheres, you know, like what is the function of poetry? What is its role, particularly in times of crisis? And a lot of the most valuable answers, I think, that have arisen in response to that question is that, you know, quite simply, the poetry is processing, and whether it's processing a personal or a global feeling, it's taking something from the particular to the universal. And I know one of the questions that Dermot asked kind of at the start of this session, these panels, were, you know, like what is sort of the function of, I suppose, how do we kind of conceive of, I guess, the creative brain in relation to global trauma, or processing like huge global events like we're currently living and will continue to live, I'd imagine. And I think poetry can be not a solution, but a part of that processing. You know, there's a lot of really fascinating literary theory about this idea, particularly when there's huge traumas that happen within, you know, like I'm talking about it like a trauma to humanity. Like, for example, like Adorno wrote that it's barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz, because a horror so inconceivable has happened that it would almost be inappropriate to provide language to talk about it. But then you have poets like the very famous kind of post-Holocaust poet Paul Celan, who famously kind of constructed his own language in order to talk about these sort of traumas. And it's this idea that that language needs to be rebuilt after these kind of horrific things that happen, and that poetry plays a role in doing that, in finding the words to articulate what has happened. And I think in no insignificant way, the Pomethon is part of that, and I hope that there'll be more of them in the future. You have an extract that you might read, if you said.
Yes, I'd love to read. And yeah. I guess it's a bit of a cento, because I couldn't read all 500 lines, so I took a little bit out. And this is, again, thanks to all the many people who submitted their lines to us, and of course for Seamus for putting them together. as the opening line, which was provided by John Sheehan, intrepid intruder, stalker of unwashed hands, deliverer of fear at a level unknown to this generation, a thief of time, tempering us to be vigilant, unwittingly spreading, we answer its commands, reflected in your eyes, mirrored by your soul. Who speaks now for them and me? You have frowned on hugs and kisses from our puzzled grandchildren, waving uncertainly from beyond mute garden gnomes. And COVID brought the curtain down. Carers 24/7 don't need a pandemic to have to cocoon. Heartsick, I crave for the silence to end. I miss the breath of your voice on my face. Waiting, watching, wanting, no one comes. The flatness of this year, my grandkids shrunk to 2 dimensions. We olden oaks sway in your silent storm. Some fall, but our hearts hold strong. I am the last leaf on the branch, and no wind will move me to the ground. You are not eternal, you will go, and once again our lives will flow. There will be hugs, tears of joy will be seen when we raise our middle finger to COVID-19. Bird song lifts my spirit as I walk in my garden. Surely Christy Moore will write a song after this and we'll dance to it. We turn towards the stormy sea and our lighthouse blinks. The first daffodil, a grand stretch in the evening. Intrepid intruder, this is my parting glass. We didn't know how lucky we were. No, we never knew just how lucky. We have slowed down. Now we chat together. Now we have time. It's hard, so hard, but we must remember this too will pass. The only good side of COVID is that our earth has recovered. Rivers run free, abounding with fish. I am not defined by my age. I am defined by what I do to heal the planet. I look out to the world of this storm with a Cairn's eye, and I listen more deeply to the heartbeat of the earth. We are not broken, just bent out of shape.
Powerful. Thank you so much, Francesca and Amelia. And I think what's really struck me is the power of something like Creative Brain Week when we look at, say, literary and neurohumanities and neuroscience and the meaning that can be brought from each side. Again, I could listen for a much longer period, but thank you so much to you both.
Thank you.
And before we take a short break, we have 2 more fantastic speakers, and they are joining us to discuss dancing neuroscience research. And they are Magda Khichmarska and Anusha Mohan. And Anusha is a research fellow at the Trinity Institute of Neurosciences and the School of Psychology. And Magda is a dancer, researcher, and creative aging teaching artist based in New York City. You're both very welcome, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And we're awaiting our technology, but I think we'll begin out with a little introduction. So thank you, welcome to all here in this space physically with us, and also in the virtual space that we've all gotten to know so well recently. My name is Magda Khichmarska. My friend and colleague Anusha Mohan, who I now know physically for a few days. And we actually met a few months ago and are here to talk a little bit about our collaboration as a dance artist and as a neuroscientist. And as we were, and our collaboration in a program that we call Brain FM, which in short, we describe as an educational tool in which we use and combine dance and science, where we weave them together to learn about one another and to learn about individuals and community. But we thought that in order to really enter into this conversation, we have to step back a little bit and explain how we got to this conversation, and that really requires us to tell a little bit about our story. So I am a mover. I can't really talk very well sitting down, so I'm going to stand up, and apologies to whoever needs to do the adjustment of the camera. But I wanted to begin and tell a little bit of my story, which is really a story of displacement. it's a story of language, and it's a story of being in the body, and discovering the body. And it starts way back in a post-Soviet country in Poland. And it begins with me as a little girl, 8 years old, as an immigrant, packing all of my belongings into one bag and going across one continent, an ocean, and another continent down to a little city in the southwestern United States that is the land of indigenous peoples and inhabited by Chicana people. And then me and 2 people who had been displaced when I was an infant, and who at that point when I arrived were neither in my physical nor my mental memory. And I don't think my sound is working, is it? Oh, thank you. I get costume checks. Oh, okay. Oh, lovely. Oh, I have arrived. Wonderful. I have literally arrived. So my parents had also been displaced, but they left before I had been able to process physical and mental memories of them. So by the time I arrived, not only was the place that was my home a foreign place, but the place around me was a foreign place. And I, as a child, as a dancer, and as a kinesthetic person who at that point I didn't know that's who I was, felt tremendously, viscerally lonely. That was the beginning of my life. And I knew even at that very beginning that the thing I craved most was human connection. This that we have right now, I craved community, but I didn't have the language and the capacity to do that, and I lacked confidence. So when I was in spaces of community, I shrank, I withdrew. And it wasn't until I discovered dance that I found the language. Suddenly, I had confidence. And that transformation, that opening, that awakening for me was so profound that I have dedicated the rest of my life since then to exploring it, to investigating it, to experimenting with it. It started with an investigation of self, an understanding of how I navigate that space, and then an investigation and a curiosity with the other. And that's an ongoing process, it's a lifelong process. And then curating and exploring how to cultivate spaces, how to cultivate interaction, how to facilitate your discovery into that space. That's what drives my practice. So when Anusha and I connected, by the time that we arrived, I had, at that point, dedicated most of my life to working in community with individuals and helping curate spaces of discovery and experience. A lot of that working with older adults, and because of this incredible gift of the Global Brain Health Institute and the wonderful community and brilliant people therein, the experience of working and discovering that with people living with dementia. And that led me to meeting Anusha and Brain FM. And really the foundation for this work is, and what I think I'm reflecting on this, is that dance is a universal language. And we all have the ability to hone that understanding of one another in a more embodied and holistic way. And I know we have a dancer in the front, so I see you nodding. And what's I think really interesting about this, and I'd like to bring home, is that it's not something that we need to build or take or seek from somewhere beyond. It's something that's already ingrained in each one of us. It's just that we maybe haven't had an opportunity to listen or to have an opportunity to explore. And so that's where we've been conditioned, I guess, it's the word that we're looking for. We've been conditioned to pay attention in different ways of communicating. And so when we think we've been talking about this whole week about this concept of creativity, I actually I think maybe we've been asking, like, how do we pull out and draw out and find and create creativity? I don't think that's the correct answer or question. I think, in fact, creativity is all around us. We already are surrounded by it. It's really more about spaces and experiences. How do we cultivate a space that allows that creativity to sprout, that allows it to bloom and to flourish? And that is what I
I'm delighted to do it with Anusha. So I'll pass it on to you, my friend, to share a little bit about your path.
Thank you, Magda. Thank you so much. So Magda and I share, I think we have more in common than we have different, and I think that's one of the things that we always talk about when we talk about, and we've had these conversations for hours and hours together, and this is probably going to be a 20 minutes of a snapshot of these conversations. So my story picks off where Magda's story kind of is in continuum, I guess. And one of the things that I would like to reflect back from what Magda said about creativity and how creativity is not something that we have to cultivate, it's something that is very innate in us. And this is something that has been coming back to us, I feel, right from the beginning of Creative Brain Week, and when Kiran was talking about creativity as being something primal and something so innate in us. And Magda found connection with the community in dance, and for me, it was a connection with myself. So my story goes back about 20 years, and when I first started dancing, and the first 10 years of my life was all about dance. It was about, I know that people introduce me as a neuroscientist because that's what I do. I'm a postdoc at the School of Psychology, but there's a whole backstory to me being a postdoc. When I started off with my dancing days and with my theater days, I'm not a stage performer right now, but I used to be a stage performer, and I've traveled all over India as a dancer and as a stage artist. And I created dance dramas, and that was my life at some point of time. But to completely dedicate my life to just the arts was it almost felt like going away from a part of myself. Because to really come to think of it, for me, my creativity is opened up by the science. Science informs me. So if dance is the seat of my intuition, I'm a very intuitive person. I like to feel things. I'm a feeler, and I'm a very intuitive person. I make very intuitive decisions. Moving to Ireland was not rational. It was more so my boss saying, "Hey, I have a job in Ireland. Do you want to come?" Sure. And moving to Ireland was one of the best things in my life, because in Ireland I found myself. And why I say I found myself is because in Ireland, I came to do science in Ireland, but here I am speaking in Creative Brain Week about the story of me and the story of integration. And to me, bringing the science and the arts together is being whole, is being me. And for quite some time I've done the science. So my CV, I am quite proud of my CV, and I would like to say I think, knock on wood, I'm still very humbly going to say that I have a good CV. And I have everything on paper. I think when I left, I did my PhD in America, and when I left America, I had everything on paper as a good PhD student. I graduated with 9 publications, and I got my funding to do my research. And if you see it on paper, people will be like, "Oh wow, this is somebody who would be who would definitely become a faculty member." But it didn't fulfill me. So what I actually realized, and what happened in the last 1 year of my life really turned it around. It was almost pulling me inside out. And what I realized was the art doesn't make sense without the science, and the science without the art has no heart. And to me, putting the science and the arts together and integrating that as myself was a process of self-discovery. And the third piece of the puzzle, which really struck together and which really put Brain FM into what it is today, was creating a social impact. How are we going to use the arts and the science to talk to people, to take the science from what Francesca beautifully said, take the science from the lab and give it to people? So I totally resonate with what Francesca said, is that the art and the poetry in their case and the dance in our case is a voice to taking the science to a wider audience and giving back the agency and giving back people the agency of knowing, making that informed decision. And how are we, I'm not going to sit and present 40 different figures and say, okay, statistically there is a p-value which is less than 0.05. Everybody's going to lose me. Nobody cares about a statistical p less than 0.05. But how many of you here have attended our Brain FM sessions, learned about or heard about our Brain FM sessions, and want to attend our Brain FM sessions? It doesn't talk about statistical p less than 0.05. It's about an embodied experience. It's about Brain FM at its core is really the amalgamation. I hate to call it a collaboration. I don't want to call it it's not just a collaboration. It's not an interdisciplinary educational tool as what we would say as, if I were to write a paper on Brain FM, I'd probably call it an interdisciplinary educational tool which combines embodied experience with scientific knowledge. No, it's an amalgamation. It's bringing together the heart and the brain together, and the body and the brain and the heart together in one amalgamated product and present to you as an experience. And that is what Brain FM is. The Brain FM has basically Magda and Anusha written all over it. Brain FM is about Magda and Anusha. Brain FM is the story of Magda and Anusha. And that's what Brain FM is. Do you want to continue, Magda?
Yeah, so we thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about what exactly we do, like the process. And it's interesting because when Anusha and I come together, we both, we're actually very similar, and yet we're also very distinct, and it's the differences and where we intersect that makes our collaboration so special. But part of it is that we ask different questions, and that we have different key intentions behind what we're seeking to arrive at. And I think, Anusha was talking a little bit about this recognition of the desire to empower, that the connection to knowledge and awareness is an empowerment tool. It supports and promotes agency, which is something that both of us can relate to. And I enter into this space also from the understanding that systems exist that block and have severed trust both into our bodies and with health and with other systems that promote body and health. And so this is an opportunity for us to share and discourse in multiple ways of knowing and understanding, and to amplify spaces for different knowing to have value and to have meaning. And that for me feels like both, not just as for bodies and for health, but also for individuals and community. And that to me feels like an opportunity to address that inequity. So, Anusha, I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about how we look and think about the way that we think about impact and what we seek for the intention of Brain FM to be from each session.
Absolutely. I think we actually were having this conversation yesterday, and we actually realized that this was actually a very good discussion point for us. I think Magda and I, we although, like she said, although we come from we have very different questions. And for me, in a Brain FM session, I'm looking at, I am at the end of the day a scientist, I guess. There's that part of me which is always thinking about, okay, what are our audience going to remember from this? So for me, it's important for the content to come through, and for it to be, for the content being an embodied experience from a scientific standpoint for me is actually a method of making knowledge stick, in very colloquial terms, if you may. So because there's a lot of research out there that talks about multisensory learning, multisensory integration, how we can, how a multisensory didactic experience, when you combine it with a very emotional embodied experience, can enhance the learning aspect of it. So we know, for example, all of us, probably a lot of us, remember something very distinct and very vivid from our childhood, like the smell of cookies that our grandmother made, or the hug that we received from, the hug that I received from my mom when I was first leaving India for the first time. So we remember these things so distinctively because we strike that emotional chord. We strike that very special place, and from a very scientific perspective, I think we have a lot of people who are studying how to make memories stick, how to enhance your ability to recall. And to me, from a very scientific perspective, the embodied experience is very important for people to take this content in a long-term way and to take this content and remember it and apply it in their day-to-day life. And that's what, for me, in each Brain FM session, that's what I'm looking for, is how can our audience use the agency of dance to remember this scientific content, so that they can, when they're making a decision, they're going, oh yes, I learned this. For example, we know some of our people say, oh, I loved learning about the year through the dance. I'm never going to forget. Every time I hear something, I'm going to remember how we hear, for example. So that is something for me. That's I feel like, oh wow, okay, our audience has learned something today. So, but what does it look like for you?
Well, for me, and I think it's interesting. It's always really fascinating for us to have these conversations, because we arrive in this space from understanding kind of the dichotomy and the different multiple approaches, but really being really respecting one another's point of view. For me, it's always about the experience as an embodied person, somebody who navigates kinesthetically, and I seek to support and reinforce experiences that then might move, inspire, and then help that knowledge stick, but perhaps in a different way. And now I was thinking about this, and leading up to our conversation, and I was thinking about, two examples from a dance perspective of things that I think are important. One of them is creating avenues for new connection. And I was thinking, actually, I know that we're here at Trinity College Dublin, and we all know Ian Robertson and Brian Lawler, but on the other side of the sea, there's also Bruce Miller and Victor Valcourt. And Bruce Miller talks a lot about the circuitry in the brain and how the arts can awaken circuitry that was dormant and was never used before. Well, I think of engaging in the arts, especially in dance, we're awakening circuitry of connection between each of us. Each of us is a neuron, we're creating that circuitry between one another. And that may have been dormant. But whenever we learn a new language, we have to approach it slowly. It requires us to slow down. It requires us to really listen and be patient with one another. So that's one of the things that I think about. The other one is how to amplify confidence. Now that's a really tricky thing to approach, but from a kinesthetic space, I think especially when we're engaging in these enriched spaces, these spaces that are filled with novelty, where we're wanting to place people out of their comfort zone into something new, it's really, really important to also anchor that in a space of trust and in something that you can feel confident in. And so from a kinesthetic standpoint, I think about choreography and muscle memory. So we're all, I think about choreography from a traditional standpoint, whether it's Bharatanatyam dance or it's classical ballet. We think about series of steps that are emblazoned into muscle memory from practice. But each one of us every day walks through life with a library full of choreography. And that is what I draw from when I invite you into a co-creative space of making a dance together around a piece of content that we've just acquired. So it anchors you into something that you're an expert in that you then can share with one another. And it can be a very profound confidence-building experience. But I know that we're running out of time. So with that, we'll just say there's one more opportunity if you want to hang out with us tomorrow at 6 p.m. We'll be at Unit 18 if you would like to join us for a Brain FM session. And thank you, Anusha.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Anusha. Thank you, Magda. I'm again sorry to cut this short, and fantastic. There's another opportunity tomorrow to hear more along the same lines. I was struck by your own story and displacement, I guess, and how that's drawn from dance and its meaning, and then from the science side in terms of creating and giving greater understanding, how actually it's about the practice, it's about that embodiment, and how dance inherently has that meaning, but how each perspective just helps to elaborate on that meaning. So again, we could draw it out much longer, I know, but thank you so much to you all. We'll take about 10 minutes, if that's okay, and come back here at about 20 past 3 for 4 more fantastic people to join us. And thank you again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.